world where you can say, God stepped here. This makes the place of Mount Sinai a very special place with great significance because of the history of the events that happened there. This was a very significant happening in the life of Moses because it changed him from a shepherd into a leader of people. Now, the presence of God called him just like it calls us. Jesus calls all of us to special tasks, and it called Moses to a special task. And so Moses is back at Mount Sinai just a few months later, and this time he's not alone, but this time he is with a vast throng of people, newly delivered slaves. I like to think about that group of people and can't believe it would have been easy to be their leader. You've all heard the phrase herding cats. I suspect that's what it was like to be Moses. While they are there, God's voice thunders from the mountain, and he gives them the Ten Commandment law, and then he gives them the Ten Commandment law on 2 tables of stone. Perhaps you recognize this picture or this statue. It's a statue of Moses in Rome by Michelangelo. It's a very interesting picture, a very interesting statue. Now, I just have to ask this question. Did any of you know what the music was we led in with? It's the theme music from the Ten Commandments. There we go. At least somebody got it. I was hoping somebody would. It amused me, so that's really all that matters. Because of the significance of what happened at Mount Sinai, people have been trying to figure out where is Mount Sinai for years, 2,000 years at least. Is the Mount Sinai somewhere in the Sinai peninsula? Is Mount Sinai part of Egypt? Or is it in Saudi Arabia? So just where is Mount Sinai? And the truth is, we don't know for sure. I'm going to have to do the same thing I did last night when we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to give you a number of choices as to possible places where Mount Sinai might have been. So let me give you those choices, and you can study it up on yourself. This is a map of the Sinai Peninsula, and in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, there's a mountain called Jebel Musa. You can see it right on there. Some people think that this could be Mount Sinai. It's 6,791 feet tall. It's in central Sinai. And an early church father named Eusebius, that I spoke about this morning in my sermon, suggested that this was the original site of Mount Sinai. But of course, Eusebius is telling us this 1,700 years later after the events of Mount Sinai. So I'm not really sure I find Eusebius convincing. Then this is Jebel Musa. And then there's another possibility. It's Jebel Musa, and you can see Jebel Musa right here. Jebel Musa literally means the mountain of Moses, literally. It is 7,363 feet tall in southern Sinai, and the Emperor Justinian and a group of monks identified this in about the 6th century AD as the site of Mount Sinai. And so since the 6th century AD, there's been a monastery at this place. And we are going to come back to this in a little while. But even though the monastery itself was established in the 6th century AD, there were monks living in caves in this area many hundreds of years before that came. The third one is called Ras Safsafi. And you see it right here. It's very close to Jebel Musa. There's an archaeologist by the name of Siegfried Horn, who was a Seventh-day Adventist archaeologist, one of my heroes. I never had a chance to meet the guy. I'm sad about that. Ras Es Safsafa is 6,540 feet tall, and it's a twin peak to Jebel Musa. Same base, just a different peak. And in front of Ras Es Safsafa, there you see I forgot to show you Jebel Musa. And then Ras Es Safi, that's the peak of Ras Es Safa. And out in front of the peak is this large, broad plain. Now, the reason Siegfried Horn liked this as a candidate was because there were tens of thousands, some people estimate up to 2 million free slaves coming out of Egypt, these Jewish former slaves, and they had to have a place to camp before the mountain. And so Siegfried Horn suggested this is a good possibility. The fourth possibility is based upon some work by a guy named Larry Williams, who wrote this book called The Mountain of Moses, The Discovery of Mount Sinai. And he says that it's at a place called Jebel al-Lawz. And there you can see that if you know anything about geography, you can see that he takes you all the way across the Sinai Peninsula, and he says it's actually in Saudi Arabia. And he has proposed a whole new route for the Exodus and all kinds of stuff. Now, he has made a video. You can watch it on YouTube. And really, the video is very convincing. He bases it on some things that he found there. He says he found the golden calf altar. He says that he found 12 pillars, and by this point in time, there were 12 tribes. And so he says there were 12 pillars, one for every tribe. And then he says kind of the most important argument is that the top of Jebel al-Lawz is black. And because God's presence came down, it blackened the rock. And so that to him is one of the convincing points that this is really Mount Sinai. I have to tell you that I've read his book, I've studied his ideas, and I frankly find them just a little bit too cutesy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm always suspicious of any archaeologist who goes to a place and finds exactly what he's looking for. Do you understand what I'm saying? He finds exactly what he hopes to find there. Now, I'm not suggesting he planted something or anything like that. I'm just suggesting that everything is open to interpretation. And when you get to a site, you might find 10 stones and say, well, there could be another one there. Yeah, it looks like another one there. And so I just find his arguments to be not compelling. And then there's one that's very recent. It's called Jebel Esh Tarif, and it is in the Sinai Peninsula also. You can see there its location. It's a flat-topped mountain, and it has a broad plain around it, and so that would be a place for the Israelites to camp. My friend Greg and I visited this about 8 years ago when we went to Egypt, and it was a very fascinating place to visit. Around the mountain, it shows that there have been worshipers here. Here are some stone art in the desert, and most archaeologists think this was probably they call it a stone circle. Probably had to do with some kind of worship of some deity. And so maybe this was a place of worship. Which is true? That's the question. And I don't know. I have no idea. But I actually like Hashem el Tarif, the last one we looked at. But because Jebel Musa is the traditional site, I'm going to take you there tonight because really of all of the 5, this is the only place that really has a history associated with it after Mount Sinai experience. And so tonight we're going to go to Jebel Musa. The hike up Jebel Musa is not too hard if you're in decent shape, but it's not too easy if you're old like me. I've climbed to the top of Jebel Musa twice. It took me about 4 hours each time, and the path is this winding path up the mountain. Usually you try to arrive in the morning, and so the hike is at night. So you don't want to hike during the heat of the day in this area because it's a desert area. And so the first time we hiked up Mount Sinai, we left about 8 p.m., and we actually ended up spending the night up there. I got home from this experience many years ago and preached a sermon entitled "One Night on Mount Sinai That Must Have Seemed Like 40 Days and 40 Nights," because it was a long night on top of Mount Sinai that night. It was a beautiful, clear lit sky that night. While we were going up, the moon came up, and it was just a lovely experience. I actually climbed the first time I went up, I climbed most of the night by myself. And it gave me a lot of time to contemplate God's blessings in my life. Along the way, there is places to buy water and soft drinks and candy bars. And I guess you could say, you see the tent up on top there, that is the local 7-Eleven. You can also, if you start wearing out, you can also call for a taxi cab. The local taxi service. The second time I climbed Mount Sinai, I was so absolutely shot, so absolutely worn out before I got to the top that I considered climbing with a little help from my friends. But I didn't. It's an amazing thing that happened. I was just about ready to give up and get a camel to go the rest of the way, and my guide, who climbed us every single night, he was leading our whole group. I had a backpack on with water and my camera, and it probably weighed 10 to 12 pounds. It wasn't really heavy because I'm smarter than that, and had some nuts in it for energy. And he said, "Here, I'll tell you what. Let me just carry your backpack. You'll make it. Let me carry your backpack." And it's like, no. You know, I'm a man. I can't let you carry my backpack. But rather than hire the local taxi, I let him carry my backpack. So he put my backpack on his back. And about 15 minutes later, my friend Greg says, "Okay, I'm done. I'm getting a camel." And my guide says, no, don't do that. Let me carry your backpack. So he had my backpack on his back and Greg's backpack on his front. And we made it. And it's just amazing that just that little bit of help from somebody else got us over the edge. And so I've learned that even, it was a life lesson to me, that even when you're trying to help somebody, sometimes all they need is just a little help. You don't have to do the whole thing for them, but just a little bit of help for some people can help get them over the edge. And that was a very valuable lesson for me to learn. And so we made it to the top of Jebel Musa, and the goal is to see the sun come up. And so we made it to the top just in time for the sun to rise up in the distance. On the top, there were several hundred people. And it's the common event, walk up overnight. There is on top of Jebel Musa several 2 chapels. Think about the fact that all the stones that are built in these chapels were probably carried up. So it gives you an idea of how hard this would have been. And so we sat on the rocks and watched the sun come up. I sat and repeated the 10 Commandments. I memorized the 10 Commandments probably by the time I was 10 or 12 years old. And so we sat and I repeated the 10 Commandments, and the view is just spectacular. Now, going down is also an interesting experience because it brings a whole new set of stresses on your feet. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but on my way down, I discovered that I should have cut my toenails the night before. Because all the way down, I didn't feel it going up because my feet are, by gravity, going to the back of my shoes. But on the way down, your feet, by gravity, go to the front of your shoes. And all the way down, my toenails were poking the front of my shoes. And this sounds silly, but believe it or not, by the time I got there, I was in pain. It was really quite uncomfortable. And so even going down Mount Sinai is not that easy a job. And then finally, when you get to the bottom, you see this very interesting ancient monastery called St. Catherine's Monastery. It's basically just sitting there totally by itself in this valley. St. Catherine's Monastery was founded by, as I said, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the late 6th century AD, but there were already monks living there possibly as early as the 4th century AD. And Justinian built this as a monastery, but also as a fortress. And it has changed very little in the 1400 years since then. The walls are the original walls. Originally, there were no gates through the walls of this monastery. And so the only way to get in was through a basket being pulled up and over and back down over the walls. The monastery was first dedicated to the Virgin Mary, but later was dedicated to Santa Caterina, Saint Catherine of Alexandria. And the legend was that she was a martyr whose body was said to have been deposited by angels on a nearby mountaintop whose name was Jebel Caterina. And so they named this monastery after Saint Caterina. It is an ancient place and very wonderful. Now, it's interesting because it is so far off the beaten track that not only has it not changed very much through the 1400 years, it also has been protected through those 1400 years. There is a main chapel. The monks who mind this place, who take care of this place, are Orthodox monks. And so it's you have a lot of incense burners and, the accoutrements that are typical of Orthodox type worship. This is the main chapel, and there you see all of the incense burners. You enter into the chapel through these 12th century wooden carved doors that I just think are really cool. You see this little rabbit. I'm not sure what kind of symbol the rabbit was, but carved on these doors. Inside the chapel, you see this mosaic. It's the Transfiguration. And here are the disciples at the Transfiguration. That one, you can read the name. Can anybody read the name? Peter. Petros. Peter. That mosaic dates to the 6th century AD. That's an original mosaic. They also have the chapel of the burning bush, which is said to be built over the spot of the very bush that Moses saw. And if you want to go outside, you can still see the burning bush today. At least that's what it says up on that sign, burning bush. You see but you say to yourself, wait a minute, I thought it burned up. Well, yeah. They also have a burial place there, a cemetery for the monks who work there, who live there and die there. And in the garden area, when a monk dies, they bury his body, and then after a number of years, they disinter the body and put it in what's called the charnel house. And this is one of the 6th century monks. So this skeleton has been there for 1,400 years. A 6th century monk whose name is Stephanos. And he has spent his afterlife guarding the steps to the holy mountain. And it's interesting that on the door of the charnel house is the text from Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Doesn't sound like a very hopeful Christian message to me. I would prefer to see I am the resurrection and the life, but vanity of vanities. You also find this interesting piece of architecture at St. Catherine's, because on the right-hand side, you have the church with a tower, but do you recognize what it is on the left-hand side? It's an Islamic minaret, because there were Muslim servants who lived there throughout the many years, and so at some point in time, the monks built a minaret for the Muslim servants to worship in. Now, this proved to be a real blessing, because at some point in time, when the Islamic armies were invading, during the early Middle Ages, when the Islamic armies were invading Egypt, they came to Santa Catarina and they saw the minaret for the servants, and they did nothing. They did not destroy St. Catherine's, which they probably would have done. And so this actually protected it. Because of the antiquity, at Santa Catarina's, there are at least 2,000 icons. Now, an icon is a religious drawing or painting, or perhaps a sculpture, but most of the time, drawings or paintings. Some of these are as old as the 6th century AD. They're very, very ancient. Some of the most ancient of all. And because they live so far off the beaten track, they were protected from something we call the iconoclastic period, which was in the 8th century AD, in which there were a group in the church that decided that icons were bad because of the second commandment. Thou shalt not make yourself unto thee any graven images. And so this group of people in the early church in the 8th century decided that all icons and depictions of the apostles and everything were bad. And so they went around Europe and went around the Middle East destroying all kinds of precious ancient pictures. But because Santa Catarina's was so far off the beaten track, it didn't happen here. So they have this exquisite collection of medieval art, earlier art. And here is Moses and Aaron. Here's Moses. This is John the Baptist. I always find it interesting how they paint John the Baptist. They paint John the Baptist as though he's having the worst hair day of anybody in the history of the world. You know, he's always got this wild hair and wild beard, and maybe that's right. There's actually an icon of Mount Sinai itself. This really interesting icon of the Apostle Paul. I kind of think he looks like Kenny Rogers. I don't know, don't you? And then this interesting icon. This is called the Ladder to Heaven. I showed a couple pictures of this last night in our topic of hell, because in this ladder to heaven, you have a ladder to heaven, and at the top is Jesus receiving the people into heaven. But at the bottom of the ladder is hell. And so if you're falling off the ladder, you're going to hell. And notice that you don't just fall off the ladder. You see the demons on the edge? They're like lassoing people and pulling them into hell. It's such a striking icon. And then at the top you have the saints and Jesus welcoming people to heaven. Now, the rumor is that the monk who painted this didn't just paint people. He painted people who lived in the monastery. And so the people he liked are up there. But the people he didn't like are hanging off the ladder, falling into hell. It is a very interesting icon. And then this picture of Jesus. It's one of the 5 oldest icons in the world. And this, for me, is my favorite picture, ancient picture of Jesus. I like this the best of all. This picture of Jesus is 600 years closer to Jesus than any other. But still, after 600 years, they wouldn't have really known what he looked like. They also have at St. Catherine's a library that is very, very important. A very ancient library because the books were never destroyed. And so they have books dating from the 6th century AD, literally. They have these ancient books on the shelf, 6,000 volumes, many of them ancient. There is this ancient Bible, it's called Codex Syriacus, which means the Bible in Syriac, and the word codex just simply means a book. So this is a Bible in Syriac, which dates to about the 8th century AD. And what's very fascinating is because at the monastery, none of the monks read Syriac, for many, many years, this Bible was displayed upside down until someone came along and told them. It's here at Santa Caterina that one of the greatest biblical treasures was ever found. In 1844, there was a man named Constantine von Tischendorf, a good German name, who began a journey through the Middle East looking for ancient biblical manuscripts. And he made his way to St. Catherine's in May 1844. He noticed in a trash can some bits of what looked like paper that were being used to start the kitchen fire. And when he looked at the pages, he retrieved the pages, he found 43 pages of what looked to be the Old Testament written in Greek. For those of you who know this word, the Old Testament written in Greek is called the Septuagint. And so he found these 43 pages with this very early Greek writing. The earliest Greek writing is all written in capital letters. They're called uncials. There is no small letters called minuscules at this point in time. So this is a very ancient page. And when he inquired, he was told that 2 boxes had already been burned. Wouldn't that give you a heart attack? And then von Tischendorf broke the cardinal rule. He got too excited. And he started showing too much interest, and he warned the monks that these were too valuable to burn, and he wondered, could they show him any more? Well, the concept of being too valuable sunk in real quick. And so they didn't show him anymore. He left with those 43 leaves, and he published them in 1846. In 1853, he returned nothing. In 1859, he returned, and he was getting nowhere until the day before he was to leave. He presented the steward of the monastery with a modern-day copy of the Septuagint, the Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament, all in Greek. And the steward casually remarked, "Oh, I already have a copy of that." And he produced from his closet, wrapped in a large purple cloth, a manuscript written. And there lay the treasure von Tischendorf had been searching for. He was smart enough this time to conceal his feelings, and he asked if he might look at it overnight. And so, he says, he stayed up all night looking at the Bible, and he wrote, "It really seemed a sacrilege to sleep. I wouldn't have." So what did he have? He had a Bible with an intact New Testament and a mostly complete Old Testament. Now, remember, the New Testament was written in Greek. And so he had an original New Testament Greek manuscript, and he had the Old Testament Septuagint. What did he have? He had a Bible that dated to about 350 AD. Now, Constantine the Great became a Christian in about 321 AD. So we're talking an ancient Bible that is one of the most ancient ever made. As a matter of fact, Constantine the Great commissioned in the early church leader Eusebius, to produce 50 Bibles for the churches that he was founding. And so it is possible that this Bible is one of the 50 Bibles that Constantine the Great commissioned in about 331 AD. Now, this is a real treasure. From here, the story has two parts, two ideas. They differ. The story that von Tischendorf tells is that he negotiated to get the Bible. He says the monks presented it to him to give as a gift to the Russian Tsar. The monks have a different story. The monks say he stole it. That's what the monks say. There is a letter written in Greek, signed by von Tischendorf, and I've actually seen this letter. It's in a display cabinet in the monastery, in which von Tischendorf promises to return the Bible. Well, he didn't. Ultimately, the British Museum bought this Bible in 1933 for about $500,000 in US dollars. And that's when $500,000 was really $500,000. It's a great and wonderful treasure. I've actually seen this at the British Library. It's no longer at the museum. It's now in the library. I've seen it twice. And every time I get to see this treasure, I'm just thrilled at it. Now, there are a few pages that were discovered of this manuscript after von Tischendorf, and you can still see those on display at St. Catherine's. But of course, St. Catherine's would like to have it back. And so they have petitioned the British Museum to give it back, but they never will. So perhaps the best exercise for us is not to try to figure out whether Jebel Musa is the actual site of Mount Sinai. Perhaps the most important thing would be for us to discover the significance of Mount Sinai, because it is at Mount Sinai that God came down to earth with a very specific reason, so he could give his people the law. And so Mount Sinai is inextricably combined with the receiving of the law of God. Now, I know it's not popular to talk about laws and rules in today's society because people just like to do what they want to do. I think I told you about this survey before. I talked a little bit about this last Saturday night. Gallup did this survey in which he asked people about the importance of the Ten Commandment law. And more and more people said that it was important to follow, but very few could say what even half of the Ten Commandments were. So Gallup's conclusion was that people know less and less, but they have greater and greater opinions about keeping the law of God. Some have suggested that these are the Ten Commandments, not 10 suggestions. And so if they are the 10 Commandments, should we be keeping them? And here's the real question for most of us. How can a Christian relate to the law? How can a Christian relate to keeping the Ten Commandment law? And there's a problem of a misunderstanding of a text in Romans. Romans 6:14 says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." So many Christian teachers tell their people, pastors tell their church members, that we are no longer under the law, but we are under grace. So therefore, we don't have to keep the law anymore. Well, that sounds like fun, people say. So you mean I don't have, no, you still have to do that. But I don't have, no, you still have to do that. You mean I can, no, you can't kill somebody. So what does it mean? We are not under law, but under grace. Well, Paul makes it plain it doesn't mean that we can do anything we want to, because he says, the very next text, what shall I say then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? Certainly not, he says. So just because we are not under the law as a basis of our salvation, that doesn't mean we can do anything we want to. Shall we sin because we are not under the law? No, Paul says. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, my teacher back in seminary used to tell us that the word certainly not in Greek is a phrase that is just this close to swearing. It's like absolutely not. No way. You can't. It's very strong. And so Paul's saying, no, just because you're under grace doesn't mean you can do anything you want to. No way. John continues with this idea. He says, everyone who sins is breaking God's law, for all sin is contrary to the law of God. So Paul says we're not able to just dispense with the law of God and break God's law because that is sin. And Paul says we can't sin just because we're under grace. Now, some people say that we're not under the law, so therefore we don't have to keep the law. And they quote this text. Jesus said in Matthew, "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until this purpose is achieved." So Jesus himself says that when he fulfilled the law, he didn't do away with it. That would be abolishing it. So he came to fill it full of meaning. He gave it to help us understand its true meaning. He says, if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus was not anti the Ten Commandment law. As a matter of fact, he tells us in this text in Matthew 22 that all those laws are combined with these two phrases: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commands. And so the first four commandments inform our relationship to God. No other gods, no engraved images, not take the name of the Lord God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the last six talk about our relationship with the people around us. Honor our father and mother. Do not kill. Not commit adultery. Not steal. Not tell untruths. And not covet. All of those are things that God requires of us and asks us to do. So when we look at the Ten Commandments, for the most part, we agree, but not on all of them. You know, when people tell me that they are not under law, but under grace, so therefore they don't have to keep the law anymore, I say, okay, does that mean you can lie? No. Does that mean you can steal? No. Does that mean you can commit adultery? Well, no. And I go through the list, and it really boils down to one commandment, and it's the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And so because that's the one that many people are confused about, I want to spend just a few minutes and explain that just a little bit more. So why remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? Here is the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is the fourth commandment. And many people think that this commandment is no longer binding on Christians. But I want you to understand where this fourth commandment came from. Notice it says here, it gives us the origin of the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. So when God has this group of people surrounding Mount Sinai, and he thunders down his 10 Commandment law to them at the base, he's not telling them something that's new. He's telling them about the Sabbath, which had long been established. Back in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, at the very beginning of the world, the seventh day of creation, it says by the seventh day God had finished the work that he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So back in the Garden of Eden, the Sabbath was created. And so when the Israelites are gathered around Mount Sinai, after having spent about 430 years in captivity in Egypt, God reminds them of this. I think it's interesting that he says, remember. How can you remember something you've never been told before? And so he says, remember the Sabbath day. Now, not only did God give the law, or give the Sabbath, but he also did it before Mount Sinai, another time. We have this scene in Exodus chapter 16. Now, Exodus chapter 20 is the giving of the 10 Commandment law on Sinai. So here we are for the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And he says this, then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. And so in order to feed the people out in this desert, God rained food down. It's called manna. And every morning when they got up, the ground was covered with this food, and they would pick it up and they would take it home and they would boil it or they would bake it, and they'd have food for the day. Every day, God would give this special food to them. The word manna means, what is it? And they never figured out what it was because they continued to call it manna the rest of their lives. But every day the food would be there. But not quite. Because he gave them this further instruction. Each morning, everyone gathered up as much as he needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses says, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." And so every day they were to go out and gather manna for the day. If they said, "Well, I want to sleep in the morning, I don't want to get up and do it, I'm going to get twice as much today," the next morning when they got up and tried to eat the manna, it was rotten and it had maggots in it, it said. That doesn't sound pleasant, does it? And so every day they had to go out and gather the food. But on the 6th day, they were told to gather twice as much. And then in the morning when they got up, God performed a miracle. It wasn't rotten. And so this was God's way of introducing them to the Sabbath even before they got to Mount Sinai. So even before they got to Mount Sinai, God was expecting them to keep the Sabbath. Well, there's always someone, right? So nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where he is on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. Here God performed a miracle twice every week. He rained twice as much on Friday, and on Saturday morning he kept it from spoiling because he was introducing the people to the Sabbath. There have been some that said that the Sabbath was only for the Jews. It was only in the 10 Commandment law. But here God is introducing his people to the Sabbath even before the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. He's asking the people to observe the Sabbath. Now, why? Because he'd already given it to them in creation. They'd been in Egyptian exile for 430 years. And now he's trying to remind them, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Here's what Jesus says in the New Testament about that. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus claimed a day, and he said, "That day is the Sabbath day, the day I created thousands of years ago. The Sabbath was made for man." He claimed it as his day. We saw this text last week. Jesus, as his custom was, went to the Sabbath on the Sabbath day. He went into the synagogue, as was his custom. Jesus was a regular Sabbath keeper in accordance to what he had said from Mount Sinai. We also learn that Paul was a regular Sabbath keeper. As his custom was, Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures. If you look in the New Testament and the book of Acts, you find continually the disciples are continuing to worship on Sabbath. There is no evidence of them worshiping on a day other than Sabbath in the New Testament. Evidence is plain. And then here's this interesting text in Matthew 24:20. In Matthew 24:20, Jesus is talking about the end of the world, and he's also talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he says this. He says, "Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath." Now, Jesus is looking about 40 years into the future, and he sees that there is a coming destruction of Jerusalem. And that happened in AD 70 when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews. And so Jesus is looking into the future and says, pray that your flight will not take place in winter. Well, that makes sense, right? Or on the Sabbath. So Jesus is looking 40 years into the future, and he's saying Sabbath is still going to be important. Now, that's interesting because some people think that he changed the day of worship from Sabbath to Sunday at the resurrection. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow night. Then here's this text in Isaiah 66 that's talking about heaven. It says, "As the new heavens and the new earth that I will make endure before me, declares the Lord, so will your name and descendants endure. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me, says the Lord." You know, I think this text teaches that in the earth made new, we'll still come and worship before God on the Sabbath. See, from the beginning, in the first Eden, God created the Sabbath. In the second Eden, the new earth, God says we'll still come and worship him on Sabbath. And so I think the Bible teaches us this pattern of Sabbath keeping throughout the whole Scripture. Now, it's not popular amongst Christians to call people to keep the law, because I have been called a legalist because I insist on keeping the Sabbath and I insist on keeping God's law. But I don't do it, I don't keep God's law and the Sabbath because I'm afraid God is going to, from heaven, me. I don't do it because I'm afraid of God. I do it because I love him. John 14:15, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey what I command. Now, the King James Version says it like this. It says, if you love me, keep my commandments. That sounds like a command, kind of like God's dunning you. If you love me, keep my commandments. But I think it actually says it like this. If you love me, you'll do what I command. Isn't that true? Isn't that real obedience really is a result of love? That's really the only way to affect real change is if you love someone, you'll do what you know makes them happy. And that's what Jesus wants from us. And so faith in Jesus leads us, and love for Jesus leads us to do his works. And that is not legalism. That is love and obedience. There's one last text I want to show you. In Revelation 12:17, it's talking, this is a very end-time prophecy, and it's talking about people right before Jesus comes again. It says, then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Notice that one of the characteristics of people in the time right before Jesus comes back again is that they love him so much they do whatever he asks. And by the way, one of those things is Sabbath keeping. So that's why I've decided in my life, because I love Jesus, that I want to keep the Sabbath because he's asked me to in his 10 Commandment law. Not because I'm afraid he's going to zap me, but because don't you love to spend time with someone you love? And that's what the Sabbath is all about. So here's the question. If Sabbath is Saturday and it's the biblical day of worship, why does most of the Christian world worship on Sunday? And that topic will be my topic tomorrow night. And I will give you an archaeological, but more of a historical view, because there's not a lot in archaeology I can share with you about this concept. But we will dig into some ancient manuscripts and into ancient history and try to reconstruct why people started worshiping on Sunday and why that is a bad thing or a good thing. So tomorrow night is kind of like part 2 of this lecture. So let's just close with a word of prayer here. Dear Father, it's an amazing thing to me that you want to spend time with us. And that's why you created the Sabbath. You created the Sabbath the first day after you created Adam and Eve because you wanted to spend time with them, to get to know them. And that's why you ask us to keep Sabbath now, because it's your day. It's a day you created for us to get to know you better. And how much more important is that now, since we can't see you face to face like Adam and Eve could? And so, Lord, I pray that you would help us on this topic of the Sabbath to decide that we want to spend that time with you. And while this may be new to some people here, this idea, I pray that you would help us each one to keep an open mind and that you would lead us very plainly in how you want us to follow you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, let's have our basket, or our pot rather, for our drawing. This is a Jewish oil lamp tonight, not a Christian one. So we'll give it to someone here. And the person who will take it home is 23943. 23943. There we go. Good. That's your first night having one in there, isn't it? Good. So tomorrow night is called The Forgotten History of Sabbath and Sunday. And we'll take we'll delve into ancient history. I'll try to keep it going fast enough that your eyes won't glaze over, I promise. And we'll dig this out and answer that question. So I'll be at the back door if you have any questions. Thanks so much. And we are in the countdown. We have only 4 lectures left.
What's the thing hanging from? I don't understand. I'm not the blue thing hanging.
The banner, or
Yeah, the thing hanging down with a square block on the bottom.
that's our projector.
It's a projector?
That's the projector. That's where the light comes from
Oh,
for the pictures up there.
Okay.
It's too far to go from there.